Beginning in 1914 and extending through the end of the First World War, Picasso turned away from the formal elements of cubism he himself had developed and entered a period of apparent stylistic pluralism. He began to incorporate other historical styles alongside cubism into his still lifes and figurative works. Picasso's 1919 show in Paris shocked and bewildered even his supporters, and rumors swirled about the decline of cubism. They leapt to label him a counterfeiter, a pasticheur. French critic Roger Allard's review of the show articulated their disappointment. Quote, everything, including Leonardo, Dürer, Lenin, Ingres, Van Gogh, Cézanne, yes, everything except Picasso. Concern over this seemingly spontaneous reversion to earlier historical styles was not limited to the artist's contemporaries. Even now, Picasso's stylistic pluralism continues to perplex and provoke, and is particularly fertile terrain for a discussion of style as concept and the term modernism. In this paper, I call attention to an overlooked model of style proposed by art historian George Kubler. Kubler offers an approach to stylistic analysis that addresses the specific complexity of an artwork before extending it into an oeuvre or a canon. I will assess the methodological utility of Kubler's model of style by applying it to Picasso's work during this period, ultimately arguing that Kubler and Picasso were engaged in a similar project, demonstrating via hyperbole the insufficiencies of a defined concept of style. In his 1962 book, The Shape of Time, George Kubler speaks generally on the role of style as a concept. Quote, the immense literature of art is rooted in the labyrinthine network of the notion of style. Its ambiguities and its inconsistencies mirror aesthetic activity as a whole. He attests, quote, style describes a specific figure in space better than a type of existence in time. Kubler refers to Meyer Shapiro's seminal 1953 essay, Style, which reviews how style has historically been defined and identifies some problems with the term. Shapiro observes that for many writers, a style is a pervasive, rigorous unity, and that investigating a style often becomes a search for hidden correspondences, explained by an organizing principle that rejects heterogeneity. He takes issue particularly with cyclical or evolutionary models of stylistic analysis, which lead to the mythologizing of certain artists whose work represents the high point of a style. Shapiro ultimately calls for an expanded, flexible model of style, concluding that, quote, a theory of style adequate to the psychological and historical problems has still to be created. Scholarship addressing Picasso and style has been well established, and a number of authors have specifically addressed this period of stylistic pluralism. Arnold Hauser and Rosalind Krauss, for example, take up Shapiro's cry for an expanded model of style and eschew biological approaches to stylistic analysis. Hauser argues that in this period between 1914 and 1920, Picasso himself sought to deny, quote, art as the expression of an unmistakable personality. Picasso's imitations are protests against the cult of originality. He represents a complete break with individualism and subjectivism. Rosalind Krauss sets out to deflate the mythologizing of Picasso by offering a psychoanalytic explanation of his stylistic choices, ultimately concluding that Picasso's, quote, pastiche was symptomatic of his fear of the automation of art. For cubism, she explains, was the very dismantling of the perspectival space that the photograph could endlessly replicate. Even if they avoid conflating this period with the decline of cubism, neither author sufficiently considers the specific and multiplicitous functioning of Picasso's stylistic pluralism in individual artworks, and this period continues to protrude conspicuously from his oeuvre. Kubler also sought an expanded definition of style, but took issue with Shapiro's insistence upon style as, quote, constant form. He argues in The Shape of Time that in the expansion necessary to encompass the shifting of stylistic qualities with the passage of time, the fraught term itself would disappear from view. He says, quote, everything varies both with time and by place, and we cannot fix anywhere upon an invariant quality such as the idea of style supposes. but when duration and setting are retained in view, we have shifting relations, passing moments, and changing places in historic life. Any imaginary dimensions or continuities like style fade from view as we look for them. However, over 10 years later, in a 1977 paper titled Towards a Reductive Theory of Visual Style, Kubler presents an analysis of style as a, quote, manifold of 6 dimensions, including for his readers a hexagonal diagram with corresponding components as pairs across opposite faces. This seeming about face is conspicuous, this argument not for a flexible definition of style, but for the rigidity of this model, outlined as a geometric form. One could argue, however, that Kubler and Picasso are engaged in a similar project, demonstrating via hyperbole the insufficiencies of an applied concept of style. Through his incorporation of earlier traits, Picasso explored Cubism's relationship to art of the past, interrogating its place within the art historical canon. He pushed back against conceptions of Cubism as a style in the traditional sense by blatantly and sometimes humorously undermining its constant forms. The earlier forms he appropriated were removed from their original context and distorted. Forms considered constant were first forced to undergo change. Picasso and Kubler, in this sense, both sought to demonstrate the insufficiencies of style as defined by critics and art historians by proposing alternate solutions that were explicit in their rejection of traditional definitions and could not be easily subsumed. In The Shape of Time, Kubler discusses the relationship between objects and their place in historical time, explaining that any object has a, quote, absolute age in years elapsed since it was made, but also has a systematic age in a pertinent sequence. An object may even be broken down into its traits, which themselves have their own systematic ages. Duration, therefore, according to Kubler, can be measured by 2 standards, absolute age and systematic age. So, quote, historic time seems to be composed of many envelopes. In Towards a Reductive Theory of Visual Style, Kubler outlines these traits, theoretically incorporating every aspect of a work of art, including those absent from previous models of stylistic analysis. He presents, quote, a componential analysis of style as a manifold of 6 dimensions, divided into 3 pairs corresponding to, quote, a grouping by shape, meaning, and time. This model names the clusters of traits, recognizing that each has its own systematic age. Shape includes craft and format. Meaning encompasses signage and modus. And finally, within time, period and sequence. He helps the reader visualize this manifold with this hexagonal diagram. The following slides will suggest how sequences of the components shape and meaning could be formed within Picasso's oeuvre, and perhaps also extended into the canon of Western art. They are merely examples, however, and many other sequential arrangements are possible. So within shape, craft is, quote, reciprocals of material and technique and varying relations of harmony and tension. In this series, in craft, the material is oil paint and the technique is pointillist brushstroke. They interact very differently in works by Signac and Seurat than by Picasso. Also within shape, format, quote, identifies stable configurations enduring through time and encompasses what art historians usually think of as style. Here, in format, we see similarities in composition between these Ingres-esque drawings. Kubler explains that format is better suited to diachronic studies than style because it is, quote, less heavily freighted with evolutionary associations. Signage, within meaning, includes the subject and its symbolic associations. Here we have iterations of the subject of a woman in an armchair. And also within meaning, modus defines formal choices related to content. Here we have a series of paintings of Olga Picasso. Olga's flatness and her lack of spatial context could reflect Picasso's resentment of their stifling marriage. Meaning, or content, has not been traditionally considered a component of style. Kubler, however, includes meaning as an element within his stylistic model as a generating component rather than a passive recipient. Kubler's discussion of period and towards the reductive theory of visual style is brief. He suggests that a definition of period is needed to speak of style in the traditional sense, but it remains only ambiguously defined. In Kubler's model, the term period may be serving its purpose simply in this ambiguity. The period may not be defined unless we are able to recognize the end of a trait sequence, which is impossible if the trait is still in use. Therefore, we may assume that period applies overarchingly to the works considered. Finally, Kubler complicates the idea of the systematic age of shape and meaning by locating them in a sequence. In Towards a Reductive Theory of Visual Style, he suggests that his idea of sequence actually encompasses all the other components in his model. He defines sequence as, quote, the dated succession of gradually altered repetitions of the same trait. Each trait of a work of art may therefore be placed in a succession of past and future iterations. Kubler's notion of sequence also shows that choices are not plucked randomly from an endless array of stylistic possibilities, but that each trait also has its own age within the oeuvre of an artist. An analysis of sequence reveals ideas threading through the artist's consciousness during a period of time. We turn now to one of Picasso's most flagrantly pluralistic works, the 1917 Return from the Baptism after Lenin. The artist's preoccupation with representation itself becomes particularly clear in this painting. A Kublerian analysis begins with craft, again, material and technique. Kubler explains that within this dimension, material and technique themselves have different systematic ages, and that the relation between the two will affect all other components. Craft is therefore the foundational dimension. Picasso uses oil paint, a medium with a long systematic duration, and since its introduction, artists have experimented with its ability to render light on a two-dimensional surface. Although the stippling technique Picasso employs in Return from the Baptism recalls the techniques of the Neo-Impressionists, he refuses to allow the color impressions to divide into the chromatic components. In the background, overlapping transparent planes of dots create a collage of shapes which does not materialize into any recognizable form. At the bottom of the painting, the stippling appears not as a span of colored dots, but rather an undulating mass of white dots. He reverses the technique so color becomes negative space. His pointillist strokes are very small, but in places he applies them in a group against a lighter background, creating blotches of color simultaneously amorphous and precisely defined. Even as four figures are clearly expressed, Picasso makes no attempt at naturalistic depiction. The vertical figure in the center, for example, is described as a patchwork of overlapping planes, which fails to express anything itself and ultimately serves to simply outline his shape. This separation of color does not help the viewer identify the direction of the light or orient himself within preceding and receding forms. With a small amount of modeling on the figure's right arm, Picasso integrates the figure with the background just enough so he doesn't simply float two-dimensionally on a decorative background. Within the dimension of craft, he holds the viewer on the brink between representation and abstraction. Picasso's Return from the Baptism refers to a specific painting, the 1642 Peasant Family or Return from the Baptism by one of the French Lenin brothers. It depicts a peasant family arranged horizontally across the canvas with 3 adults grouped around a table and 2 small boys in the wings. This orderly composition is typical of Lenin's scenes of peasant life and could therefore be considered an element of the artist's style, falling under Kubler's definition of format. Lenin's peasant family in an interior, for example, shows a similar grouping with shadowy figures in the background. In Picasso's version of Return from the Baptism, he retains this horizontal composition, but confines it within a vertical canvas. The group appears truncated and compressed as he appears to move figures forward and push them back to make room, undermining the harmony of Lenin's arrangement. Within signage, this painting's subject matter is derived completely from an earlier work of art. The artist does not simply incorporate earlier techniques into his own compositions, but works with one piece specifically, subverting its intended iconography as he appropriates Lenin's subject matter but undermines its symbolic associations. Lenin's peasant family, with its pyramidal arrangement of figures, conveys a specific understanding of patriarchy and gender roles within a particular culture and time period. the importance of each figure indicated by his or her position in the scene. In Modus, Picasso obscures these associations by pushing the figures together and distorting their relative sizes. He does not allow the viewer to read these symbolic associations. The viewer does recognize, however, Picasso's direct reference to Lenan's work. The subject of the painting becomes the art itself, removed from its context and divorced from its original style. Picasso shows how even signage itself may be plucked from its context and applied to a cubist work. Cubism, he shows, is not a style in the traditional sense, but rather more generally an investigation of space and an acknowledgement of the flatness of the canvas that exposes, evades, and transcends styles' ill-defined and limiting parameters. Finally, Return from the Baptism after Lenin may be placed within sequences in both shape and meaning, not only in the general history of art, but also specifically within the works of Picasso. Picasso explored the incorporation of decorative surfaces into his collages, for example, by using a similar pointillist technique, drawing attention to the material quality of the painted surface. In Return from the Baptism, he uses the stippling technique differently, placing the painting within a sequence of Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist investigations of the chromatic components of color and light, even as he undermines the intent of these earlier artists. In meaning, Return from the Baptism would seem to fall into a sequence of group portraiture or French peasant scenes, but since Picasso does not allow the subject to signify, it better fits into a sequence of art addressing art itself. In Kubler's terms, at the time, this was a sequence with a short systematic duration, with Picasso at its fore. Kubler actually discusses artistic invention in The Shape of Time. Quote, "Aesthetic inventions are focused upon individual awareness. They have no therapeutic or explanatory purpose. They only expand the range of human perceptions by enlarging the channels of emotional discourse." He contextualizes individual invention within a larger human consciousness, arguing that the two are parsable. In signage, Return from the Baptism after Lenin refers directly to a particular work of art. Picasso found a way to very clearly articulate the modernist concept of reflexivity. The painting not only exists in sequences in art, but also lies within a sequence of human ideas and reflects the dissemination of general channels of thought into the aesthetic world. Kubler's discussion also dims the aura surrounding Picasso, whose career has been thrust on a pedestal, as his individual style almost becomes a model for Cubism itself. Picasso was certainly an innovator, but Kubler contextualizes individual invention within a larger sequence of human perception. Kubler's complementary model of stylistic analysis may be too exhaustive for regular practical application. It is really only reductive as it breaks apart a generalized conception of style into units subject to individual scrutiny. According to Kubler, style, dependent on, quote, synchronous choices among synonymous possibilities, it's not itself a phenomenon of constancy through time. Kubler's componential model, therefore, advances the idea of visual style as a spatial rather than a durational concept. How useful is this resurrected concept of style? In The Shape of Time, Kubler writes, quote, "It is disturbing to those who value the individuality of a thing to have that individuality diminished by classifications and generalizations. We are caught between difficulties. Single things are extremely complicated entities, so complicated that we can pretend to understand them only by generalizing about them." Kubler suggests the way out of this is to simply accept the difficulty of single things and to instead draw comparisons between their aspects. This has important implications for narratives about modernism, which operates as a play of signs, referring not only to the exterior world but also to the canon of Western art. Art historian Edward Fry writes, "The special achievement of Cubism, and above all Picasso, was to reinvent classical mediated representation, and in that reinvention, also to transform it, so as to reveal its central conventions and mental processes." Kubler's model shows how this reflexive operation works at the level of a single painting, embraces a painting's specific operation. It offers an entrance to analysis of a painting like Return from the Baptism after Lenin, otherwise a blip in Picasso's oeuvre. Further, a Kublerian approach to this period of Picasso's stylistic pluralism shows that the artist consciously defied traditional parameters of style by disguising and subverting the expected constancy of Cubist forms. Kubler's dimension of time, and in particular sequence, expands this resistance beyond an individual painting to a more general reflection on the relationship of modernism to art in the past. Thank you.